Central Minnesota Territory, January 24th, 1857, 4:47 in the morning, cabin interior temperature 59 degrees Fahrenheit, outside negative 42 degrees, with 60 mile per hour winds tearing across the frozen prairie. A 38-year-old widow and her 3 children slept comfortably beneath wool blankets, while 10 cattle and 4 horses in the stone chamber 12 feet below radiate to the head upward through careful gaps in the pine floorboards. The thermometer hanging near the door had not moved in 6 hours. The cooking stove held only ash. Yet, the floor remained warm enough to walk barefoot. 5 months earlier, in late August of 1856, Bjorn Halvorsen had made a prediction at the New Ulm General Store. The Swiss widow, he said, was attempting the impossible, building stone walls taller than any cabin in the territory, then stacking a timber dwelling on top like some medieval peasant. She would kill those children come winter. By early December, Bjorn had burned through 14 of his 18 cords of firewood. Ingrid Steinman had used 3. On the third night of what territorial records would call the Brown County storm, when outside temperatures are held at 42 below zero and Bjorn's cabin interior dropped to 26 degrees, despite burning his children's bed frames, he carried his half-frozen daughter through waist-deep snow to knock on the door of the woman he had called foolish. The floor beneath his boots was warm. His daughter stopped shivering within minutes. What did this Swiss widow understand about thermal mass, an animal heat that experienced male homesteaders had completely missed? And how did knowledge passed down through 7 generations of alpine stone masons prove more valuable than all the conventional wisdom of the American frontier? August 1856. The prairie grass stood waist-high and golden when Ingrid Steinman walked her 160 acres for the first time as legal owner. The land office clerk in St. Paul had examined her paperwork twice. A woman, filing alone, no husband. She had placed her marriage certificate on his desk, then Herman's death certificate, ship manifests showing their arrival in New York dated April 1855, Herman's death at sea 3 days before landing. The clerk had stamped the homestead claim without meeting her eyes. Now she stood on her land studying granite outcrops that pushed through the Minnesota soil like the bones of the earth itself. Her son Eric, 12 years old, stood beside her, holding a surveying chain. Her daughter Elsa, 9, carried 3-year-old Anna on one hip while shading her eyes against the August sun. Ingrid opened a leather-bound journal. The pages were yellowed, the handwriting cramped and precise, German script in her grandfather's hand. She had watched him write in this journal by lamplight in the Bernese Alps, recording measurements and ratios that dated back 2 centuries. The final page had been written specifically for her. For Ingrid, it read, "When men say, no stones say yes. Trust the mathematics, trust the physics, trust what I have taught you." She traced the words with one calloused finger. Then she looked at the granite outcrop 50 yards distant and began calculating. 20 feet by 18 feet for the foundation, 12 feet high, 18-inch thick walls for proper thermal mass. That meant approximately 283 granite blocks, each measuring roughly 18 inches long, 12 inches wide, 8 inches thick. Eric watched his mother's lips move as she did the arithmetic. "Can we really build it, Mama?" Ingrid closed the journal. "Your great-grandfather built 43 of these. I watched him build 4 before we left Switzerland. I know every measurement, every angle, every principle." "But you are..." Elsa stopped herself. "A woman," Ingrid finished. "Yes, I am also my grandfather's best student, and his stones held against alpine winters that would make Minnesota look gentle." She had done these calculations on the ship from Europe, while Herman lay dying of typhus in the hold below. Late at night, by stolen candlelight, she had worked the numbers. 10 animals at 500 British thermal units per hour each. Stone walls 18 inches thick to absorb and store heat during the day, release it slowly through the night. A cabin elevated 12 feet above the livestock with intentional quarter-inch gaps between floorboards for radiant warmth. The physics were sound. She just had to convince herself she could lift the stones. The next morning, she began quarrying. The granite came from an outcrop half a mile from her claimed cabin site. She worked with an iron pry bar, a sledgehammer, and methodical patience learned from her grandfather. Each block needed to be small enough for one person to move, but large enough to build thermal mass. By the end of the first day, she had extracted 7 blocks. Her hands bled through cloth wrappings. Her back screamed. Eric managed 3 blocks, working alongside her, moving with the determined silence of a boy, trying to become the man his father would never be. On the 4th day of quarrying, Bjorn Halvorsen rode past on his way to town. He was 44 years old, Norwegian, with the thick shoulders of a man who made his living with physical labor. He sold firewood to the community, 14 to 18 cords per household per winter. Good money, reliable demand. He reined his horse and watched Ingrid lever another block free from the outcrop, building a cabin with a Steinman. Ingrid did not look up. A house barn, stone foundation 12 feet high, livestock below, living quarters above. Silence stretched between them like a taut wire then. You mean to live on top of animals? My grandfather's family did it for 200 years. Bjorn dismounted. He walked to her pile of extracted granite, 31 blocks stacked carefully. You will need how many? 283 blocks for a 20-foot by 18-foot foundation 12 feet high. Bjorn did the mathematics in his head. At her current pace of 7 blocks per day, that was 40 days of work. Snow comes in 6 weeks. You will not finish. Your children will sleep in a wagon through Minnesota winter. Then I will work faster. But with respect, Mrs. Steinman, this is man's work, stone masonry, heavy timber framing. You cannot. I can and I will. Ingrid set down her pry bar and met his eyes. My grandfather was a master stonemason. He taught me from the time I could hold a trowel. I know mortar ratios. I know load-bearing calculations. I know thermal mass principles. What I do not know is how to quit. Bjorn shook his head slowly. Pride kills on the frontier. So does ignorance of basic physics. Ingrid picked up her sledgehammer. Good day, sir. That evening, Bjorn stopped at the general store in New Ulm. The owner, Wilhelm Schneider, was closing up. 3 other men loitered outside: Silas Gunderson, the carpenter, Thomas Heinrich, the blacksmith, and Pastor Braun. The widow Steinman, Bjorn announced to the group. She is building stone walls 12 feet high, planning to live above livestock like it is the Middle Ages. Silas raised his eyebrows. 12 feet, that is taller than the church. And she is doing it alone except for a boy. Bjorn shook his head. It is madness. Someone should intervene before those children suffer. Pastor Braun, 60 years old, with kind eyes, spoke carefully. She has broken no law. She is attempting the impossible. A woman doing stone masonry. Her grandfather was a master builder, the pastor said quietly. She told me when she filed her claim, 40 years of experience in the Alps. Perhaps she knows something we do not. Or perhaps, Bjorn countered, she is a widow, desperate enough to believe fairy tales. The men dispersed, but the story spread. By Sunday service, half the settlement had heard about the Swiss widow building a barn with a cabin stacked on top. September. By the first week of September, Ingrid had extracted 86 blocks. She and Eric had developed a rhythm. Pry lever roll stack. Her hands had calloused over into leather. Eric worked with grim determination, and together they managed 10 blocks per day when weather held. The first course of foundation went down in early September, 20 feet by 18 feet. Stones set in mortar made from lime. Ingrid burned herself in a pit kiln. The ratio was precise: 3 parts sand to 1 part lime, mixed with just enough water to bind without weakening. Her grandfather's formula, tested across 2 centuries. Silas Gunderson rode out on a Tuesday to watch. He was 42, Norwegian, like most settlers with a reputation for quality carpentry. He walked around the foundation, measuring with his eye and plumb line. "Walls are true," he said finally. "I will give you that." Ingrid continued laying stones. "They are more than true. They are calculated for thermal retention." 12 feet is excessive. Why such height? Thermal mass. She tapped the stone with her trowel. Granite absorbs heat slowly, releases slowly. The mass moderates temperature without constant fire. 10 animals below producing 5,000 BTUs per hour. The stone stores that heat during day, releases it at night. The cabin above stays warm. Silas frowned. "We burn fire for warmth. That is how it works. You burn 14 cords per winter. I will burn 4. That is impossible. It is physics." Ingrid set another block, checked it with her level. "Cold is cold, Mr. Gunderson. Whether in the Alps or Minnesota, the laws do not change." Silas left, shaking his head, but he did not mock her. Not yet. The mockery came later in mid-September when Eric dropped a granite block on his foot. The boy was trying to move a particularly heavy stone, lost his grip, and the block fell straight down onto his left foot. He did not cry out, just went white and collapsed. Ingrid heard the sound rock hitting flesh and bone and knew immediately it was bad. She ran to him, removed his boot carefully. The foot was already swelling, turning purple. At least 2 bones broken, possibly 3. For 10 days, Eric could not work. Ingrid's pace halved. 4 blocks per day instead of 10. Elsa tried to help, but at 9 years old, could not manage the weight. Baby Anna played in the dirt nearby, singing Swiss lullabies, oblivious to the growing time pressure. On September 20th, there was a town meeting at the church. Ingrid learned about it 3 days later when Pastor Brown rode out to her claim. He dismounted slowly and stood silent until Ingrid set down her trowel. "There was a discussion, Ingrid, about your situation." Her stomach dropped. "What kind of discussion?" Bjorn Halvorsen raised a concern, said your children are living in a wagon, winter approaching, mother working herself to exhaustion on an impossible project. The pastor's voice was gentle, but his message was not. He proposed the county take temporary custody, place the children with families until you have proper shelter. The world tilted. Ingrid reached for the foundation wall to steady herself. There was a vote, yes, and it failed. 7 to 5. 7 to 5. 7 men had voted to take her children. Ingrid felt sick. Who voted against? Myself, Silas, Wilhelm from the store, the Heinrich brothers, and 2 others. Pastor Brown placed a hand on her shoulder. "You have friends, Ingrid, but you also have doubters. Finish this before they vote again." After he left, Ingrid sat on her partially completed foundation and allowed herself 5 minutes of tears. Eric found her there. His foot was still swollen, but he could hobble now. "I heard," he said quietly. "We will not let them take us." "No," Ingrid said, "we will not." She worked 16-hour days after that, rising before dawn, working past sunset by lantern light. Her hands bled. Her back was a constant scream of pain. But the walls rose. October 1st foundation height 9 feet 11 inches. October 15th 11 feet 4 inches. October 20th the first frost came. Ingrid woke to white grass and her breath fogging in the wagon. Baby Anna coughed. Eric looked at his mother with worry in his eyes that looked too old for 12. 8 more inches, Mama. 8 inches, she confirmed. Then we frame. On October 26th, she laid the final stone, 12 feet 1 inch tall. The foundation was complete. November. Silas Gunderson arrived the next morning as if summoned by the completion itself. He stood looking up at the stone foundation, expression somewhere between admiration and bewilderment. "You actually did it. Now I need help with the timber framing." Silas rubbed his jaw. He was a practical man, not a cruel one. "You really mean to put your family up there, above livestock?" "The livestock will eat us. 500 BTUs per hour per animal. 10 animals equals 5,000 BTUs continuously. The stone stores that heat like a battery." "Where did you learn this?" "My grandfather built 43 of these structures, kept families warm through alpine winters at 50 below zero. This knowledge is not secret, Mr. Gunderson. It is simply old. We forgot it when we stopped needing it. Silas stared at her. Then he sighed. I will help frame it. Not because I believe it will work, but because I will not have a woman's death on my conscience if I am wrong. They raised the cabin frame in 6 days. Oak beams 10 inches thick spanning the stone walls. The cabin measured exactly 20 feet by 18 feet, sitting perfectly atop the foundation. Pine log walls 8 inches thick. Low-pitched roof just steep enough to shed snow. 7-foot ceiling at the ridge. Every choice calculated to minimize the volume of space requiring heat. The floor was 2-inch pine planks laid with precise quarter-inch gaps between each board. Silas questioned this repeatedly. Gaps let cold in from below. Gaps let heat up from below, Ingrid corrected. Warm air rises. That is not opinion, that is physics. The animals produce heat. Warm air rises through these gaps. The cabin stays warm. You truly believe this? I know this. By November 12th, the cabin was complete. Ingrid moved her 10 cattle and 4 horses into the stone basement. She bedded them on 18 inches of fresh straw. She had purchased a mercury thermometer in St. Paul, an expensive luxury, but necessary for documentation. She hung thermometers at 3 levels, basement cabin, floor, cabin, ceiling. Then she recorded the first measurements with no fire anywhere in the structure. Outside temperature 36 degrees, basement temperature 45 degrees, cabin floor level 53 degrees, cabin air at head height 51 degrees. The animal's body heat alone was raising the cabin temperature 17 degrees above outside air. Ingrid made Eric write every number in a journal. Date, time, temperatures, observations. Her grandfather had taught her that documentation convinced skeptics when words failed. On November 18th, Bjorn Halvorsen came to visit. He found Ingrid outside returning from the basement level where she had been checking on the animals. She wore only a wool shawl despite the morning temperature of 22 degrees. Cold morning, Mrs. Steinman? 22 degrees. That is all you are wearing. The basement holds at 48 degrees. I was only outside for a moment. Bjorn followed her up the exterior stairs to the cabin entrance. He stepped inside and stopped. The air was comfortable. Not cold, not warm. Comfortable. He could see a small cooking fire in the corner stove. Just enough flame for the oatmeal pot bubbling on top. What is your temperature? He asked. Ingrid pointed at the thermometer. 57 degrees. We will add 1 more log after breakfast. For comfort. Bjorn shook his head slowly. That fire is too small to heat this space. The fire is not heating this space. The animals are. The stone walls store their heat during the day, release it slowly at night. The system regulates itself. This cannot work. But it does work. Come downstairs. I will show you. She led him to the basement. 14 animals in a space 20 feet by 18 feet by 12 feet high. The air was humid, warm thick with the smell of hay and healthy livestock. The thermometer read 48 degrees. Outside is 22, Ingrid said. Down here is 48. 26-degree difference created by animal body heat alone. This warm air rises naturally through the floor gaps. No pumps, no mechanisms, just physics. She placed Bjorn's hand on the stone wall. It was warm to the touch even in the November cold. Stone remembers heat. During the day when the animals are active and produce maximum body heat, the walls absorb that thermal energy. At night when it is coldest, the walls release the stored heat back into the space. The temperature stays stable. No wild swings like in a wooden cabin. Bjorn pulled his hand back. How much wood have you used? Since moving in on November 12th, 3/4 of a cord, mostly for cooking. I have burned 2 cords in the same time. And your cabin temperature? Bjorn did not answer immediately. Then quietly, it varies. 80 degrees near the stove, 40 in the corners. We cannot keep it steady. Because wood has low thermal mass, heat goes into the air, air escapes through cracks. You are fighting physics. I am working with it. Bjorn left without another word, but something had shifted in his eyes. Not belief, not yet, but the first crack in certainty. December. Winter arrived with authority. 8 inches of snow on December 4th, 6 more inches on December 9th. Morning temperatures dropped steadily. By December 20th, dawn readings reached 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Ingrid maintained her documentation. Every morning, outside temperature, basement temperature, cabin temperatures, wood consumed. The journal filled with data. December 10th, outside 8 div basement, 46 dgf, cabin, 56 dgf. Wood used 2 logs, cooking only. December 15th, outside 4 dgf, basement 45 dgf, cabin 55 dgf. Wood used 3 logs. December 20th, outside V0 dgf, basement 44 dgf, cabins 54 dgf. Wood used 3 logs. Totally wood consumption for December, 1/2 cord. Meanwhile, Bjorn's chimney smoked constantly. Thick black smoke that spoke of overfiring and green wood. His wife Astrid had mentioned at church that they were burning through cordwood faster than expected. Their daughter Sigrid, 6 years old, had developed a persistent cough from the smoke and dry air. On December 22nd, a traveling trader stopped in New Ulm with news from St. Paul. The weather station had recorded unusual atmospheric pressure readings. A massive cold front was building over Canada. Historic cold, the kind that killed. It could arrive within days. Pastor Brown called an emergency meeting at the church that evening. 23 families gathered, faces tight with worry. The weathermen in St. Paul predict temperatures of -40 degrees, the pastor said. Perhaps colder, sustained for several days, possibly a week. We must prepare. Inventory your supplies. Wood, food, medicine. If you doubt your ability to survive, this town is 30 miles south. Some may need to evacuate. After the meeting, families scattered to prepare. Men split wood frantically. Women sewed extra blankets. Children were pulled from play to help gather and stack fuel. Ingrid found Bjorn outside the church staring at the stars. His breath was a white cloud in the lamplight. "How much wood do you have remaining?" she asked quietly. He did not look at her. "Enough." "Bjorn, 2 cords, perhaps less. That is not enough for a week at 40 below." "I know." His voice was tight. "I know. My door is open. If you need shelter, I do not need charity." He turned to face her and there was something raw in his eyes. Fear beneath the pride. "I have kept my family alive this far. I will keep them alive through this. Stubbornness is not warmth. And your stones might fail, Mrs. Steinman. What then?" Ingrid met his gaze steadily. "They will not fail, but when yours do, my door remains open." She walked away before he could respond. The next 3 days were controlled chaos. Ingrid added 6 inches of straw bedding in the animal basement, checked food stores, filled extra lamp oil containers. She was calm because she had done the mathematics 5 months ago and knew her system would hold. On January 22nd, she gathered her children around the table. "A severe storm is coming. Very cold, but we will be safe." "How do you know?" Elsa asked. Ingrid placed her hand flat on the cabin floor, still warm despite the outside temperature dropping to -12. "Because of grandfather's knowledge, the stones will hold heat. The animals will keep producing it. This floor will stay warm. We will be comfortable." "What about the neighbors?" Eric asked. At 13, he understood more than his siblings. "Some will struggle." Ingrid chose her words carefully. "If they need help, we will give it." Across the settlement, Bjorn Halvorsen was splitting wood by lamplight. His hands were cracked and bleeding. The pile of remaining firewood looked pitifully small. 1 3/4 cords if he was honest. Maybe less. Astrid came outside wrapped in shawls. "Bjorn, you need rest. Need more wood. If it gets as cold as they say." Her voice broke. "We will not make it. Not with this." Bjorn drove the axe into the chopping block and left it there. He looked at his wife and saw the truth reflected in her eyes. "If it becomes desperate," he said finally, "if we truly have no choice, We will go to the Steinmann place. When it becomes desperate, Astrid corrected. When? They both knew she was right. The new year arrived with teeth bared. January 1st, 1857, 6 o'clock in the morning. The thermometer outside Ingrid's cabin read negative 14 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the cabin held at 54 degrees. No fire had burned since 9 the previous evening. 9 hours without heat, and the temperature had dropped only 3 degrees. Ingrid recorded the numbers while Eric added kindling to the cooking stove. Outside, she could hear the settlement waking to the sound of axes biting wood. The rhythm of survival, the sound of men fighting cold with labor. She used 3 logs that day, all for cooking. Bjorn used 3/4 of a cord. The pattern held through the first week of January. Outside temperatures ranged from -8 to -22 degrees. Clear skies, brutal dry cold. On January 3rd at 3:15 in the morning, Bjorn woke to crying. His youngest daughter Sigrid was sitting up in bed, shivering despite being fully dressed with blankets piled on top. He checked the cabin temperature, 31 degrees. The fire had died. He had banked it carefully before bed, but the cold was relentless. Now the cabin was freezing, and his daughter was crying, and his wife Astrid was already struggling to relight the fire with shaking hands. It took 45 minutes to get flames established. Another 30 minutes for the area near the stove to warm to 65 degrees. The far corners remained at 38 degrees. The children huddled by the fire wearing every piece of clothing they owned. Bjorn's hands were splitting now, deep cracks in the calluses from constant wood handling. One crack on his right thumb had gone green, infected. The line was creeping toward his palm. That same morning, at the Steinmann cabin, Ingrid descended to check her animals. The basement thermometer read 46 degrees. The cattle were calm chewing hay, their breath creating humid fog in the lamplight. She ran her hand along the stone wall. Warm. The thermal mass was performing exactly as grandfather had promised. Upstairs, her children were still sleeping peacefully. The cabin temperature had held at 54 degrees all night. She used 2 logs that day, both for cooking. By January 7th, the disparity was impossible to ignore. Sunday service. The families gathered at church, and anyone with eyes could see the truth written on their bodies. The Halvorsen children looked gaunt, pale, constant sniffles. Sigrid had frostbite on 3 fingers, despite never leaving the cabin from the cold inside her own home. Thorsten Bjorn's 10-year-old son had a splinter infection on his palm from helping split wood in sub-zero temperatures. The boy held his hand pressed against his chest, trying to hide the swelling. The Steinmann children looked healthy, pink cheeks, no coughs. Eric's hands showed old calluses from quarrying months ago, but they had healed clean. After service, Ingrid quietly offered Astrid a small clay pot. Salve for the children's hands, beeswax and pine resin. Astrid took it with trembling fingers. Thank you. Bjorn saw the exchange. His jaw tightened. His pride burned hotter than his inadequate stove. January 10-20. The slow freeze. The cold deepened day by day. January 10th. Morning low -18 degrees. Ingrid's journal entry. Outside 18 degree. Basement 45 degree. Cabin 56 degree. Wood used yesterday 1.5 logs. Cooking only. Total used since Nov 12 3.25 cords. Remaining 5.75 cords. Bjorn's cabin that same morning interior temperature 34 degrees when he woke. He burned half a cord that day trying to maintain basic comfort. His remaining supply 1 3/4 cords. Maybe less if he was honest. January 15th brought a brief warm spell. -2 degrees. Felt tropical after the previous week. But the weatherman's warnings from St. Paul grew more urgent. The massive Arctic outbreak was coming, potentially within a week. January 18th. Another town meeting. Pastor Brown stood before the congregation with a telegram in his hand. I received this from St. Paul this morning. The weather station confirms the cold front is moving south faster than predicted. It could arrive within 4 to 5 days. Temperatures may reach negative 40 degrees or lower. Duration 3 to 5 days, minimum, possibly longer. The church went silent. Negative 40 for multiple days was a death sentence for anyone unprepared. Inventory your fuel immediately. The pastor continued. Be honest about what you have. If you cannot survive a week-long siege, make arrangements now. Pride is not worth your children's lives. That evening, Bjorn sat on what remained of his woodpile and did mathematics he had been avoiding. 1 3/4 cords remaining. In extreme cold, his cabin would consume approximately 3/4 of a cord per day just to keep the interior above freezing. That gave him barely 2 days. The storm was predicted to last 3 to 5 days minimum. He would have to start burning furniture, fence posts, tools, anything combustible. And even then, he might not have enough. Astrid found him sitting in the dark. We should go to Ingrid before the storm hits. Ask if we can stay. No. Bjorn, I said no. His voice was hard, final. The voice of a man whose identity was built on providing and protecting and knowing the right way to do things. We will manage. But they both knew he was lying. January 25-23. The gathering dark. 2 days before the storm hit the settlement, made final preparations. Ingrid was methodical. Extra straw for the animals. Food stores checked. Lamp oil sufficient for 10 days. Water containers filled. She explained to her children what to expect. The storm will be loud, frightening, but the stones will protect us. The animals will keep us warm. We will be safe. What about our neighbors? Eric asked quietly. If they need us, we will help them. Other families were less prepared. Bjorn spent those 2 days in a frenzy of wood splitting. His infected thumb throbbed with every axe swing. His pile of firewood remained pathetically small. He began tying furniture with the calculation of a desperate man. On the evening of January 22nd, Astrid packed a bag in secret. Blankets, extra clothes for the children. If it got bad, when it got bad, they would need to flee quickly. The storm arrived at 4:30 in the morning on January 23rd. Ingrid woke to winds that sounded like nothing she had heard in Minnesota. This was Arctic wind, wind with the weight of glaciers, wind that screamed. She lit a lamp and watched the thermometer by the window. The mercury was dropping visibly. Negative 26, negative 28, negative 31. By 5 o'clock, negative 35 degrees Fahrenheit. By 6 o'clock, negative 38. The wind chill made those numbers meaningless. Exposed skin would freeze in under 2 minutes. Ingrid dressed and descended to check the animals. They were restless, but not panicked. The basement held at 43 degrees. The stone walls were working insulating against the savage cold. Back in the cabin, she added 2 logs to the stove. Not for survival, for comfort and breakfast. The cabin temperature read 56 degrees. At the Halverson cabin, chaos had already begun. Bjorn had been awake since 3 in the morning, feeding wood into his stove at a rate that terrified him. By 6 o'clock, the cabin interior measured 36 degrees despite the stove glowing dangerously hot. Near the stove 80 degrees. 5 feet away 43 degrees. In the corners where the children slept 33 degrees. The temperature differential was extreme. Hot air rose and escaped through gaps in the roof. Cold air poured in through wall cracks. The stove was a losing battle. By 8 in the morning, outside temperature negative 40 degrees. Wind chill negative 65. Bjorn had burned 1/4 cord in 3.5 hours. At this rate, his remaining fuel would last less than 2 days. The storm was predicted to last 3 to 5. He started looking at furniture with new eyes. The children's small table, the extra chairs, the trunk Astrid had brought from Norway. Not yet, Astrid whispered. There is still wood. There is not enough. Bjorn's voice was hollow. January 23, the first day. Noon arrived with no change. The storm was a white wall. Visibility 0. Temperature negative 42 degrees. At the Steinman cabin, life continued almost normally. Eric helped his mother prepare lunch. Elsa played a card game with baby Anna. The cabin temperature had held at 57 degrees. 3 logs used since dawn, all for cooking. Ingrid descended twice to check the animals. Both times the basement read 43 degrees. The animals were calm, eating hay, producing it steadily exactly as her grandfather had promised. At the Halvorsen cabin, survival was becoming desperate. By noon, Bjorn had burned 3/4 of a cord. He had 1 cord remaining. The cabin interior swung wildly between 28 and 90 degrees, depending on proximity to the overfired stove. Smoke was thick, acrid, burning their eyes and throats. The chimney was overfiring dangerously, but Bjorn had no choice. Less fire meant freezing. Sigrid was coughing constantly. Thorsten sat very still, wrapped in blankets, his face pale, too pale. Astrid pulled Bjorn aside. "This is not working. I know. We have to do something. I am doing everything I can. It is not enough." Her voice broke. "Bjorn, please." "Not yet," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. By 6 o'clock that evening, Bjorn started burning the children's table. Astrid watched him break it apart with an axe. She said nothing because there was nothing to say. The table burned hot but fast, gone in 90 minutes. At 10 o'clock cabin interior, 26 degrees despite continuous fire. Bjorn was down to 3/4 of a cord, less than a day of fuel remaining. The storm showed no signs of weakening. At the Steinmann cabin that same evening, Ingrid recorded her daily measurements. Outside -42 degrees, basement 43 degrees, cabin 57 degrees. Wood used 4 logs total. The children went to bed comfortably. Eric read by lamplight before sleeping. Baby Anna crawled on the floor without needing extra blankets. The floor itself was warm enough. Ingrid sat at her table and wrote in grandfather's journal. Day 1 of storm. System performing exactly as calculated. The stones hold. The mathematics were correct. Grandfather knew. January 24th, the breaking point. 2:47 in the morning. Day 2 of the storm. At the Halvorsen cabin catastrophe. Bjorn had fallen asleep from exhaustion. The fire died. When Astrid woke at 2:30, the cabin interior measured 24 degrees. She tried to wake Sigrid. The child would not wake. Sigrid, wake up." Astrid shook her daughter. The little girl's eyes opened slightly, but there was no recognition. Her skin was ice cold. Her lips had a blue tinge. "Bjorn." Astrid's scream cut through the dark. "Bjorn, she is not responding." Bjorn jerked awake. He grabbed his daughter. Her body was limp. She had stopped shivering, the late stage of hypothermia, where the body begins shutting down to preserve the core. "Get the fire going," he shouted. Astrid tried. Her hands were shaking so badly she could not hold the flint steady. It took precious minutes to get a spark, more minutes to coax flame. By the time fire established, Sigrid's breathing was shallow and her lips had gone from blue to grey. "She is dying," Astrid whispered. "Bjorn, our daughter, is dying." Bjorn looked at Sigrid, at his wife, at Thorsten, who was also too still, too quiet, breathing shallowly under blankets. He looked at his remaining firewood. Half a cord, maybe less. And the night was only beginning. The mathematics were brutal. They would not survive this storm. Not here. Not in this cabin. "Dress them," Bjorn said. His voice cracked. "Every piece of clothing, every blanket, everything." "Where?" "To Ingrid Steinmann, now." Astrid's eyes filled with tears. Thank God. They bundled the Sigrid in every blanket they owned. The child barely responded. Bjorn wrapped Thorsten similarly. The boy was conscious but confused, his speech slurred. Bjorn opened the cabin door and the wind hit him like a physical blow. The cold was not just cold, it was a presence malevolent, searching for any exposed skin to destroy. He carried Sigrid. Astrid carried Thorsten. They stepped into the whiteout. The journey from the Halvorsen cabin to the Steinmann homestead was 200 yards. In good weather, a 3-minute walk. In this storm, it was an expedition into hell. Bjorn could not see 5 feet ahead. Within seconds of leaving his cabin, he lost sight of it in the whiteout. The world was erased. Only wind and snow and cold that penetrated every layer of cloth like it was nothing. He knew the direction, had walked to Steinmann's place dozens of times, but in zero visibility direction became prayer. He moved forward, counting steps, 1, 2, 3, trying to walk straight, but the wind pushed from the side, disorienting, making straight lines impossible. 50 steps should be halfway, but he saw nothing. 75 steps, still nothing. 100 steps, too far. Had he veered, was he walking parallel, missing the cabin entirely? Would they die 50 feet from warmth? Sigrid was completely limp in his arms. He could not tell if she was breathing. Astrid stumbled behind him and he grabbed her coat to keep her upright. 120 steps. He stopped, turned slowly disoriented, shouted into the storm, Ingrid Steinmann. The wind swallowed his voice. He shouted again. Nothing but wind. They were going to die out here. Then a light, faint, flickering. 40 feet to his left. Bjorn changed direction, stumbling through waist-deep drifts. The light grew stronger. A lantern. Someone in a doorway. Ingrid Steinmann. She had heard something, a shout perhaps, or just instinct. She stood in the threshold. Lantern raised warm air from her cabin, fogging around her. Bjorn half fell through the doorway. Astrid collapsed behind him. Ingrid did not ask questions, did not waste a single second. Eric blankets from the floor, warm not hot. Elsa heat water, warm not boiling. She took Sigrid from Bjorn's arms. The child was ice cold, unresponsive, breathing barely perceptible, late stage hypothermia. Ingrid had seen this once in the Alps when 2 children fell through ice. She stripped off Sigrid's frozen outer layers, then the inner layers underneath. The child's skin was white, lips blue-gray. Hypothermia, Ingrid said calmly. Advanced. We warm her slowly or her heart stops. She wrapped Sigrid in blankets Eric had warmed on the cabin floor. Not hot blankets, warm blankets. Then she placed heated stones around the child's core, not against the skin wrapped in cloth. Trunk first, never extremities first. Warming the arms and legs too quickly would send cold blood back to the heart and cause cardiac arrests. Her grandfather had taught her this protocol. He had saved 3 avalanche victims using these exact principles. 10 minutes passed. Sigrid's breathing deepened slightly. 20 minutes. The child whimpered. A good sign. Pain meant returning circulation. 30 minutes. Sigrid opened her eyes. Mama. Her voice was weak, confused. Astrid sobbed and grabbed her daughter. Ingrid turned to Thorsten. The boy was in better condition, but still dangerously cold. She repeated the protocol. Gradual. Controlled. Let the body recover at its own pace. Bjorn sat on the floor against the wall, his hands shaking. Not from cold. From the realization of how close he had come to killing his family through pride. He looked at his bare feet. The floor beneath them was warm. In the middle of negative 42 degrees outside, the floor was warm enough to sit barefoot. How? The word came out broken. Ingrid was checking Astrid for frostbite. She glanced at him. 12 feet of granite. 14 animals producing 5,000 BTUs per hour continuously. Thermal mass storing and releasing heat on a 24-hour cycle. Physics my grandfather understood 2 centuries ago. It should not work, but it does work. Bjorn put his head in his hands and wept. January 24th, 26. Cohabitation. The storm raged for 3 days and 4 hours total. During that time, 7 people lived in Ingrid's cabin, 20 feet by 18 feet, 140 square feet, tight but survivable. The cabin temperature never dropped below 55 degrees, never rose above 59, stable, consistent. Ingrid used 1 cord of wood over the 3 days, most for cooking, some for supplemental heat during the coldest pre-dawn hours when outside temperatures reached negative 44 degrees, the lowest ever recorded in Minnesota territory. 1 cord in 3 days at negative 40 degrees. Bjorn would have needed 4 cords minimum. He had only had half a cord when they fled. On the second day, when the children were sleeping and the adults sat around the small table, Bjorn asked the question he had been avoiding for months. How does it work? Explain it to me like I am ignorant. Because I have been ignorant. Ingrid stood. Come downstairs. In the basement, 14 animals barely looked up. They were calm, content. The thermometer read 45 degrees. Outside at that moment, negative 41 degrees. An 86-degree difference. Each cow produces approximately 500 British thermal units per hour. Ingrid began. That is a measurement of heat energy. 14 animals averaging 450 BTUs each equals 6,300 BTUs per hour. Every hour, continuously. She placed Bjorn's hand on the stone wall, warm. These walls are 18 inches thick. Granite has high thermal mass. It absorbs heat slowly during the day when the animals are most active. At night, when outside temperatures drop lowest, the walls release that stored heat back into the space, like a stove that never goes out. The fuel is hay, not wood. Exactly. And hay is cheap, renewable. The cow eats grass all summer. I store it as hay. She converts it to heat all winter. Then in spring she produces calves and milk. A wood stove just produces ash. She pointed at the ceiling ventilation gaps. Warm air rises naturally. It flows through these gaps through the floor spaces above into the living area. Fresh cold air comes in at ground level, gets warmed by the animals, and stone then rises. Continuous circulation. No pumps. No machinery. Just physics. Bjorn was beginning to understand. And the floor stays warm because warm air constantly rises through it. The pine planks absorb some heat. Not much wood has low thermal mass, but enough to make the surface comfortable. You learned all this from your grandfather. I learned by watching him build these for 40 years. He learned from his grandfather. The knowledge goes back 200 years in my family. 7 generations of stone masons. It is not secret knowledge, Bjorn. It is just old. We forgot it when fuel became cheap. Now we need it again. And you knew it would work. I knew. Ingrid's voice was quiet but certain. I had the mathematics. I had grandfather's journal with 2 centuries of temperature data. I knew. January 27th, the storm breaks. On the morning of January 27th, the wind stopped. The silence woke Bjorn. After 3 days of continuous roar, the absence of sound was shocking. He thought for a moment he had gone deaf. Then he heard Eric moving around, adding wood to the stove for breakfast. The storm had passed. Outside temperature negative 36 degrees. Still brutal, but no longer immediately lethal. The sky was clear. The sun rose over a landscape transformed into Arctic wilderness. Snowdrifts reached 8 feet. The Halvorsen cabin was half buried. Bjorn and Astrid prepared to check on their home. Sigrid did not want to go. It is warmer here, Papa. I know, little one, but we need to see what remains. The trudge through snow took 20 minutes. When they reached the cabin, Bjorn's heart sank. The windows had blown out. Snow had drifted inside through the broken panes, burying everything. The stove was invisible under white. The interior was a frozen tomb, uninhabitable. Astrid looked at the destruction and then at her husband. We cannot stay here. No. Bjorn's voice was quiet. We cannot. They returned to Ingrid's cabin within the hour. You are welcome here until you can rebuild, Ingrid said simply. Why? Bjorn asked. We helped me after I mocked you, called your work foolish, tried to have your children taken away. Ingrid looked at him steadily. Because you need help, and because proving you wrong was never the point. Keeping my children warm was the point. Your children are warm now too. That is sufficient. February. The transformation. The Halvorsen family stayed 6 weeks. During that time, Bjorn learned. He watched how Ingrid managed the animals, how she maintained the bedding schedule, how she monitored temperature gradients, how she used minimal fire for maximum effect. He asked hundreds of questions. Ingrid answered every one. She showed him grandfather's journal. Let him see the calculations expressed not in complex formulas, But in practical measurements, any builder could understand 3 parts sand to 1 part lime for mortar, 18-inch wall thickness for every 12 feet of height, ventilation gaps 3 inches at base, 4 inches at top angled, 15 degrees upward, 1 animal per 25 square feet of basement space, 2-inch floor planks with quarter-inch gaps for heat circulation. Bjorn wrote everything in his own notebook. His handwriting was crude compared to the elegant German script in Ingrid's grandfather's journal, but the numbers were accurate. By the time February arrived, Bjorn Halvorsen had become Ingrid Steinmann's most devoted student. February 1st, the church. The first Sunday in February brought the community together for damage assessment. Pastor Brown stood before the congregation with grim news. 3 families had fled to town before the storm. 2 made it. The Schultz family father, mother. 2 children had frozen to death on the road. Their bodies were found a week later. 11 cabins had suffered major damage. Chimneys cracked from overfiring. Walls separated. Roofs partially collapsed. Livestock losses: 47 cattle, 13 horses dead from cold. Average fuel consumption during the 3-day storm, 4 1/4 cords per family. Most had started February with less than 3 cords remaining. 2 more months of winter ahead. Then Pastor Brown asked about the Steinmann household. Bjorn stood. The church went silent. Ingrid Steinmann saved my daughter's life, he said clearly. She saved my entire family. We would have died in my cabin. Despite burning everything I owned, the interior temperature dropped to 24 degrees. My daughter developed severe hypothermia. She stopped breathing. He paused. The church was absolutely silent. Ingrid's cabin maintained 57 degrees throughout the entire storm. She used 1 cord of wood in 3 days. 1 cord. I would have needed 4 cords minimum wood. I did not have. Her system works not because of luck, not because of magic, because of physics, because of knowledge her grandfather passed down through 7 generations. He looked directly at Ingrid. I mocked her. I said a woman could not do stone masonry. I called her design foolish. I even voted to have her children taken away. I was wrong about everything. She is the most knowledgeable builder in this territory. And I am asking, begging, will you teach us? Silence held for 3 heartbeats. Then Silas Gunderson stood. I will help any family who wants to build Mrs. Steinmann's design. Free carpentry labor. It is the least I can do. Another man stood, Thomas Heinrich. I will help quarry stone. Another and another. Within minutes, 12 men had volunteered. The women were slower. They had been the harshest critics. But finally Martha Becker stood. Mrs. Steinmann, I spoke poorly of you. I judged your choices. I was wrong. Will you forgive me? Ingrid stood. There is nothing to forgive. You did not know. Now you know. Women crossed the church to embrace her, to apologize, to ask questions. The transformation was complete. February, April, the teaching that afternoon, Ingrid gave her first formal teaching session in the church hall. 43 people attended. She explained thermal mass in plain language. Stone remembers heat. Wood forgets heat. When you burn a fire in a wooden cabin, the wood warms quickly but cools quickly. Heat goes into air escapes. Warmth is gone when the fire dies. She placed her hand on the church's stone foundation. This stone has been here 5 years. It is cold now because no heat source is near. But in summer, this same stone is warm because the sun heats it, and it stays warm long after sunset. That is thermal mass, the ability to store and release heat slowly. She drew on a slate board. Now imagine a wall 18 inches thick and 12 feet high. Imagine animals below producing 5,000 BTUs per hour continuously. The stone absorbs that heat all day. At night it releases the heat back. Temperature stays stable because the stone acts like a battery for heat. Questions came rapid fire. Does it smell living above animals? No more than a barn. The animals are clean, well bedded, well ventilated. The air is humid, actually healthier for lungs than dry, overheated cabin air. What is the cost? My foundation cost $83 in materials. Labor was my own. A traditional cabin costs $65, but you must buy 14 to 18 cords of firewood yearly at $3 per cord. That is $42 to $54 per year just for fuel. I will spend perhaps $12 on fuel this winter. I save $30 to $42 in year 1. By year 2, my higher construction cost is recovered. From then on, I save money every winter. The mathematics convinced the practical. The testimony convinced the skeptical. By late February 6, families had committed to building house barns that spring. Spring 1857. The spread. Bjorn Halvorsen broke ground on his new foundation in mid-March. He built it exactly to Ingrid's specifications. 20 feet by 18 feet, 12 feet high, 18-inch walls. She supervised, made him redo sections where stones were improperly bonded. This must stand 50 years, she said. Do it correctly. He did it correctly. By June, his foundation was complete. By August, the timber cabin sat atop it. By September, his family moved in just in time for winter 1857. The second winter became the proof. 18 house barns were operational in the New Ulm area by November. Pastor Brown, with Ingrid's permission, conducted a formal study. He visited each household monthly, recorded temperatures, documented fuel use, tracked health outcomes. The data was irrefutable. Average interior temperature house barns 56 degrees, traditional cabins 42 degrees. Difference 14 degrees. Average fuel consumption house barns 5.2 cords for winter. Traditional 16.8 cords. Savings 11.6 cords per household. At $3 per cord, that was $34.80 saved per winter. Multiply by 18 households, $626 saved community-wide. Health outcomes. Respiratory illnesses in house barn families down 62%. Frostbite injuries 0 in house barns, 11 in traditional cabins. Cold-related deaths 0. March 1858. Official validation. In February of 1858, Territorial Surveyor James Whitmore visited New Ulm. 52 years old, 20 years of surveying experience. He examined Ingrid's house barn for 3 hours. His written report was unequivocal. Mrs. Steinman's design demonstrates engineering principles typically seen only in institutional construction. Thermal efficiency is superior to any frontier dwelling I have examined in 2 decades. I recommend approval of all homestead claims utilizing this method and further recommend the territorial government consider publishing Mrs. Steinman's specifications as recommended standard. Official validation, not just from survivors, from the government itself. The Minnesota Pioneer newspaper published an article on March 15th, Swiss Widow's Innovation Revolutionizes Frontier Heating. The story spread to German and Scandinavian newspapers. Letters arrived at the New Ulm post office from Wisconsin, Iowa, Dakota Territory. Ingrid answered every letter, sent copies of her drawings, explained the principles, never charged a cent. By 1859, 68 house barns across 3 territories. By 1860, over 100. The technique spread through German and Swiss immigrant communities, earning the name Steinman Method or Swiss Barn House. April 1858, full circle. On a warm evening in late April, Ingrid sat on the steps of her house barn. The prairie was green again, wildflowers emerging. The brutal winter felt distant. Eric sat beside her. 13, nearly 14 now, taller than his mother. They call you famous, Mama. I am not famous. Your great-grandfather is famous. I just remembered what he taught me. But you built it. You proved it. Ingrid opened grandfather's journal to the last page. For Ingrid, she read aloud, When men say no, stones say yes. Trust the mathematics, trust the physics, trust what I have taught you. She closed the journal. He was right about the stones, about everything. Would he be proud? I think he knew I would need this knowledge. That is why he taught me so carefully. Not because I was special, because I paid attention. That night, she made the final entry in her documentation journal. 16 months of daily temperature readings, fuel consumption, animal behavior, cost calculations. She wrote, final assessment. System performed exactly as predicted. No failures. Grandfather's calculations proven across 16 months, including coldest temperatures in territorial history. Total fuel 8.7 quarts. Traditional cabin equivalent 32 quarts. Savings 23.3 quarts, approximately $70. She paused, added one final line. Knowledge has no gender. Wisdom has no expiration date. By 1865, house-barn variations had spread across 6 territories. Fuel consumption in adoption areas dropped by an average of 62%. Winter mortality rate fell by 40% in counties achieving 20% market penetration. The technique lasted until the 1880s when railroad coal made fuel cheap and cultural pressure for modern housing grew. By 1900, most house barns had been converted or abandoned. Today, 7 original structures survive in Minnesota. All are on the National Register of Historic Places. One is Ingrid's, maintained by the Minnesota Historical Society. The stone walls still stand, 18 inches thick, 12 feet high, as solid now as the day she laid them. Modern sustainable architecture has rediscovered her principles: thermal mass, passive animal heat, natural ventilation, working with physics rather than fighting it. The principles were never wrong, just forgotten. Until a widow with 3 children and her grandfather's journal reminded an entire frontier that old knowledge endures because it is true. Ingrid Steinman died in 1891 at age 73. Her obituary ran half a page in the New Ulm newspaper. But the final paragraph said simply, she proved that knowledge has no gender, wisdom has no expiration date, and sometimes the most revolutionary act is to remember what we were taught. Her children buried her beside Hermann, beneath a marker cut from the same granite outcrop where she quarried her first foundation blocks. The inscription reads, Ingrid Steinman, 1818 to 1891, builder, teacher, survivor. She trusted the stones and the stones never lied.